Hello, all. So this is week 10. There's only one narrated PowerPoint. This is it. And then I'm going to give you Thursday to do the homework and start your research for your research paper. So if you're ready to do that, there are two homeworks. One has to do with this PowerPoint, and the other one is kind of far-reaching. It's not due until week 12, but it's so that you start kind of thinking through what kind of paper you want to write for this class. All right, so what are we doing today? We're going to talk about myths about sex differences in language use. We're going to look at what the linguistic research says or has said over the course of of history, and then we'll talk about things like male female differences, gay speak, drag queen speak, and maybe these will give you some ideas for for paper topics as well. So there's been like two main areas of research in linguistics. The first was the sex differences, male female differences in language use, in language acquisition, in the social import of male female language use, and then as that research developed, it broadened out into more areas of gender and language. So, what perceptions have you had about sex differences? And I make this distinction here because sex is definitely a DNA chromosomal issue. So, depending on the chromosomes that you were born with, you have a sex identity of male or female based on those chromosomes. And so that's what we're talking about here. Some common claims about men and women's language use, or more specifically male female, to adhere to sex labels. Males interrupt females more than vice versa. These are common things that a lot of jokes were made on, a lot of books were written on. Women are more communicative than men. Men do not give verbal recognition of the contributions in the conversations made by women. That was a common criticism of men. Men curse more than women. Men gossip more than women gossip more than men. Women talk more with one another than men talk with one another or with women, and men speak more comfortably in public than women. These were some areas of sort of heuristic observations that were made, and then linguists questioned the validity of these. You may be questioning the validity of many of these statements as well. So, linguists in the late 60s, early 70s began to really question these kinds of statements about male-female differences. Lakoff was one of the first linguists to try to capture the linguistic data for male-female differences. She's credited for really bringing this issue of both sex and gender into the purview of linguists. And some of her early findings are about markedness constraints. We have a concept in linguistics called markedness, and it is really about what is the norm versus what is more atypical or less statistically available in a language. And this could be something like markedness could be the propensity of past tense marking versus no past tense marking, or the presence of determiners and the presence of no determiners when we look at language in a greater sense. But when she was looking at male-female differences, one thing that she noted was there was definitely different markedness constraints between male and female language terms. And so we're going to look at that in a few minutes. And then she also kind of explored the difference in language use. So she was getting both that markedness is more about, it has sociolinguistic implications, but it also is about language, what's available in the language from a linguistic standpoint. And then exploration of male-female differences in language use. This is really about the connection between language use and society, and cultural norms. So there's just a little bit about market, but let's look at that a little more closely. So when she was looking at language, particularly of English, of the English language, that was her data set. She noticed that there was a distinct markedness with terms, with nouns. So a sentence like, the nurse tested the patient for COVID-19. If we went to a pronoun, if we didn't have an image of that transaction, the propensity statistically was to choose what pronoun. And of course, the same kind of markedness applied to doctors. So if we started with the statement, the doctor called for careful procedures, and then we didn't have a visual image of who that doctor was, and we added a pronoun, what pronoun would we add? And of course, yes, it would be she for the first one and he for the second one, because these were sex marked professions in which the culture had created a markedness between nurses. So what happens in marked language is you have to make. She also noticed, Lakoff, this was Robin Lakoff, she also noticed that that there were terms, that we had created terms for items that had a markedness of what was the atypical. So the lion ate the antelope was always assumed to be male, and to prevent this, creation of the female lion that we saw in human subjects, we created special terms, lioness, or the actor won an award versus the actress. Now, we've seen a lot of these terms go by the wayside, particularly like actor and actress. But during this time, and even probably if we explored this phenomenon today, we would have to ask, are there still marked terminology for female versions? So my question would be, let me go back. Let me go back to that. It would be, does this still happen today? Does this phenomenon still occur? Another thing that Lakoff explored, and then that would be something, if you were interested in, you could actually explore through a paper. You could see what marked terms still exist, and are they divided on that male-female continuum, or are they on some other issue? So the other thing that she explored was the way that males and females use language differently. That was the question. Do they actually use language differently? And so her findings suggested and credited some of these beliefs that women were more likely to use fillers, sort of these kind of hedge your view and make it less strong. Tag questions do the same thing, right? If we're in a conversation and I say, she is very nice, isn't she? I want your confirmation instead of just me making the blanket statement that she is nice. Rising intonation, she noted that occur on declaratives more so with females speakers than males. So it's really good, that rise, almost like Valley Girl talk, but that rise, which also seems to question the validity of one's own statement. That at least is the conjecture that Lakoff is making, that females use more empty adjectives, divine, charming, cute, that they use more precise color terms like magenta and aquamarine instead of just, like red and blue. They use more intensifiers, just and so, very. They hypercorrect grammar, which means that when you're uncertain of the correct form, but you know that there is a more prestigious, more socially acceptable form. Will try to shoot for that form, and sometimes they get that wrong. I mean, hypercorrection occurs in learners. It occurs in children who. It occurs in all kinds of politeness situations. So, if you know that there's this rule about who and whom, and then you choose the wrong one because you're trying to get the right one, you're not sure which one, and so you might say, whom went to the dance, instead of who went to the dance, because you know that there's this prestigious whom out there that you want to. You make sure that you use to show that you're of that educational status, intellectual status, and you often will overcorrect. People often this statement between you and. Now, between is a preposition, so it needs to select the object form. It would be between you and me, but people often hypercorrect because they're afraid to use the object form. They don't want to misuse I, so they'll say between you and I, even though that's grammatically incorrect, but that's often a hypercorrection situation. Women, and according to Lakoff's research, use super polite forms and indirect requests. So instead of saying, hey, can you close the window, please? They will say, oh, it's cold in here, in the hopes that the other interlocutor will get the hint and close the window. Or euphemisms. Instead of saying urinate, they will say pee-pee or something like that. So they will avoid strong swear words by substituting them with something less socially unacceptable. So fudge and my goodness. They use a lot of emphatic stress. Oh, it was brilliant, So she kind of reinforced these claims that women did a lot of these social things that made them appear inferior to men. Now, after her research came out, people were really critical of it. They really sort of interrogated her methods, and found that she did not present statistically significant statistical descriptive stats on her research. And so she was making observations by observing people in conversations, observing people, and she would write about those observations. It was Du Bois and Crouch who said, no, that's not sufficient. That's not a good linguistic study. Let's do an actual comparison. Let's look at male-female talk. Let's use the same number, or relatively the same number of speakers or items that they're using, and let's do a statistical analysis of that. And they found that really that research did not hold up as strongly as Lakoff had projected. If you want to read a critique of Lakoff's work, I have posted Buchholz and Hall's 1995 critique of that, and they kind of go through the research that took place from 1975 to probably 94, that countered these kind of claims that Lakoff made. So you will find that in Week 10's Reading and Media folder. Tannen is another person who studied the male-female differences in language use. She did look at conversations between women and men, and she used linguistic methodology that we use in cross-cultural communication. So when linguists or linguistic anthropologists are looking at the language that takes place between two speakers of different languages, or of the same language but different cultures, she used that kind of methodology to explore men and women's language use. She also looked at children to see how young these kind of patterns evolve, and so again, you'll see my dialogue or conversation marker there, so that some of that research is posted, and you'll find that also if you want to watch those clips. Unfortunately, I mean, in class we would be able to watch all those things together and talk about them, but I have provided them so you can watch them. They're very interesting to see the relationship between the way that even little boys talk to each other and the way that little girls talk to each other. So overall, her findings show that that very early on, children prefer to play with the same sex, and that those result in differences in the way that children speak to each other of the same sex. So physical orientation changes. Women tend to sit face to face, lean in toward each other, while men tend to sit at angles or parallel. I don't know if this jives with what you see out in your own communities. Um, she she did find that women tend to give more cues when they're listening, back channeling cues, such as yeah, as they're listening, kind of acknowledging that they're listening, than men do. But one thing that she noted is that what were the social and relationship consequence of these differences? And so even though men don't do this, there's nothing positive or negative about the fact that if you use back channels or you don't use back channels. But she found that women would feel that men weren't listening. Now it's key that she makes note that they felt like they weren't listening. We'd have to do additional studies to see if the men were actually listening. We'd have to give them comprehension cues. Then we'd have to expand that research to really look at women who don't give back channeling cues, and see if they're listening, or even see if women who give, or people in general who give back channel cues, is that an indicator that they actually are listening, or is that something that they're doing in lieu of listening? So there's a lot of issues with Tannen's research as well. But it got us thinking about these differences. And so all of these patterns were kind of started to be studied in the late 70s, early 80s, and still have a lot more work to be done. These kind of relationships between language and social use expanded out to studies about with doctor-patient communications and interactions that have been very profitable, into courtroom interactions, interrogations, police interrogations, you name it. These kind of were the foundations for saying, how do we do this and how do we do it better? So there's just a few of Tannen's works. If you are interested in this, notice that she studies both men and women conversations. She studies gender and family interactions. She studies mothers and daughters. But again, you have to read critically, because she's looking at patterns and she's making inferences and analysis and as to what that means socially. So what does the research say? Well, I want you to kind of think through what criticisms you might have of Tannen, but there are others. She does also use a lot of anecdotal evidence from just observations. Now, ethnography is based on observations. It is a methodological practice where you can go and observe and take notes or videotape within a context to try to understand that context from within. And so it is a methodological approach used by sociologists and anthropologists, but it has some, it has criticism in that how much can you generalize, and are you overgeneralizing from your observations? So keep that in mind. There is a critique of Tannen's analysis by Alice Freed. It's posted in the reading folder as well, if you're kind of interested in this cross-cultural analysis, whether that be with males, females, or whether that's with doctor-patient, teacher-student, writing conferences. I'm trying to think how this could apply to your professions. There's a whole study, body of studies on police interrogations and courtroom interactions. So for those of you who are interested in law. When we talk about gender, now we move away from the sex differences into what we now use as gender, which they often, a lot of people conflate the two now. They conflate gender and sex. When I was a kid, or all the way up until more recent times, on a form you would fill out for the doctor, it would say sex, male, female. Now you see gender, but let's kind of trace the origin of that word. So we had the term gender in language, in linguistics. So it's a new social category, but it's in language we had this term, this gender term, and it really meant how language marked different things. It didn't necessarily have to do with pronoun usage. It didn't necessarily have to do with nouns that represented people, but a lot of languages mark their determiners with a gender. That means that the noun has a gender. So if we look at Greek, man is a masculine noun, and woman is a feminine noun, but child is a neuter noun. And so it just depends. All it does is mark it with what determiner do I use? Is it if it's a masculine noun, you use a certain determiner. If it's a feminine noun, you use a different determiner. If it's a neuter noun, and this is also true not only for determiners but things like adjectives and other kinds of qualifiers. So German, man is also masculine. Woman is feminine, die Frau, and child again is neuter, das Kind. And then in French you have male and female, or masculine and feminine, and so again you have these same categories. But the term in German for a young woman is Mädchen, and Mädchen is neuter. So even though it refers to a young woman, that's what the term means. That's how they would define the word Mädchen in the dictionary. It gets a neuter determiner and neuter affixed adjectives. Whereas like turnip, which I can't remember the term for, but Mark Twain makes a big deal that turnip is a feminine noun in German. So it would get a feminine determiner. So gender started in language, and then it's being conflated. But remember, sex is the condition of physical characteristics determined by one's chromosomes, and gender now, taking it out of just language, is a social construct that means who do you identify with? So this is different than sex, and so people can identify in any number of cases, and yet we're seeing the conflation of that. I no longer see sex. Choose your sex on a medical form. It's gender. So this change began in the 60s and 70s, and now it's an accepted term. And I always kind of like to go back to that history because it ties into linguistics, and it does remind us of the difference. So it helps us really kind of keep two very different categories separate. So there has been work on language and gender. So there's a lot of work that was initially done on gay men, and it's slowly developed into gay and lesbian language use, bisexuals and transsexuals. So we're starting, it's expanded primarily in the 2000s. Early studies, I mean, it's not that no one didn't study it ever before the 2000s. So you had someone as early as Stanley in 1970 just trying to understand the terminology that was used in gay communities. So he's really just looking at this language that wasn't available to all people. It belonged to a certain communities, what we call communities of practice. And so he was trying to get an understanding of what these terms meant within that community. Also, a way that you could still study, you could write a paper, you could do some research on how these terms have changed over the years. Um, we also had people early on trying to understand, is there a difference in the way that say gay men speak, or that women speak or lesbians speak? Is there a pitch difference? Is there a prosody difference? And so linguists were just trying to explore all kinds of things. Partly getting published means you're studying something very novel, and so a lot of times these studies exist because we can ask the question, we can do the research, and it's exciting and new. A current study was posted in the New York Times. I've posted the video clip that they take out of that research, and it's called "Who Sounds Gay?" and it's a really interesting video snapshot of some misconceptions about gay speak that the population has. It is based on really strong prosodic linguistic research, but it also has some sociolinguistic elements too. So who do we model our speech after? Whether we're born female or male, what influences help us determine what kind of sentence structures we will use, what kind of prosody we will use, what patterns of emphasis or structures do we like, and a lot of that has some social import on who we identify with as we are growing up. So that's a really interesting clip. It might give you some ideas if you want to study this for your paper in one of these areas. So there's not a lot of syntactic analysis. Syntax is primarily determined by your both dialect and your level of standard usage based on your education. So there's not a lot of that research done. But there are other kinds of linguistic research, particularly prosody and lexical choice. So here's just one example. As we turn to the social, how much is of our language is really determined by our social identities, by our social communities. So I've posted a little bit of that there. I've tried to give you lots of sources that you can look up as well, and some are posted on there. So again, here's just sort of some ways that this notion of gender has made its way into linguistic research, and some sources that you might consider. So the question, for a long time was, is there a gay language? This is that work on the prosody of Who Sounds Gay. But this area is still very much ongoing. It's really trying to understand not so much the linguistic repertoire of gay versus lesbian versus trans versus straight, but it is trying to understand the language that we use to describe these communities, and the communities developed to describe themselves. And it also kind of tracks how these words go from a very isolated community, say like the gay community of the 1970s, into the general public. So I was at a conference a couple weekends ago in Berea, Kentucky, and we asked the audience, I was with Dr. Youngblood, if some of you know her, and we asked the audience, how in your lifetime has language changed? Can can you point to some discrete example? And a woman in the audience said that as a member of the queer community, it used to be that people referred to transgendered with the ed past tense marker on the word transgender. And the transgender community had decided to change that, to take that ed off of that word and no longer refer to the community as transgendered, but just transgender. And the reason for that was the ed past tense marker made it seem like that experience was done, like there was a moment where that process was complete and over, and the community had decided that no, this is an identity that keeps evolving over time, as any identity that we each have, and we have multiple identities, as different roles, as different genders, as different as whatever it is that we are, that we see ourselves as. And so she said it was a conscious decision to take that past tense ed off there. So I thought that was really fascinating. So we also talk about performance. This is not about transgender. Now, let's be clear. Barrett's work is on transvestite language, or more colloquial known as drag queens. So these are generally speaking heterosexual men who perform as women. So they don't necessarily they're not, most of them are not transforming. They're not becoming another sex. They are just doing a performance. And so Barrett's early research looked at how do they do that? How do you perform if you're a heterosexual man? What linguistic choices do you make in your performance to provide the audience with this illusion that you're being a woman on stage? And so he looked at very interesting linguistic elements. There's an interesting performance by a Louisville drag queen on here that you can watch, and you can kind of observe what choices does this person make that indicates that in his performance he is choosing lexical items, prosodic items, syntactic structures that mimic female language. And that's what Barrett's work and original work was for. He does parallel, his research does parallel a lot with Lakoff's original findings. So if you had to do an exaggerated performance of a woman, then what he's seeing is that you do some of those things that Lakoff first noticed in her sort of colloquial observations. And so these are the performance strategies of drag queens. This is something that he furthered from that early work in the 90s to a book that is From Drag Queens to Leathermen. This book is in our library. Our library is open. So if you really wanted to get this book and you probably could run in there and get it and use that. But this isn't the one area that is really interesting in the realm of drag queens when we think of RuPaul and other performers, is how does that language that it again is very much in the community of drag queens or the community of gay people, how does that enter the mainstream? So many of you probably have heard the expressions like spilling tea, or throwing shade. These have been linked to the gay community, and it used to be only certain people understood what those metaphors meant, and now there's more of an understanding by the general public. Well, how does that language get into the general public, or how are Are there samples of other language usages? And how do we, how much of the general population knows what those expressions mean? This would make a nice research project in which you could create a survey if you're up to speed on a lot of that language, or you do want to do some research on current drag queen or current language use in certain communities. You could then survey online, not face to face anymore, but online you could survey people and see how many people in your age demographic know these terms. You could survey an older generation. You could do it by regional and see if the Bowling Green community, this language has seeped into the Bowling Green community, or the Louisville or Lexington, wherever you are, that community versus another community. So that would be a nice research project that you could do all online, and send out your survey through Instagram or Facebook or something, and create it and get some results. So that's an option. All right, so for homework, in the homework folder, I'm not going to have another PowerPoint this week. I have two things for you to do. The first thing is I want you to read around in those articles that are posted, and watch the video clips that are noted on the PowerPoint slide. And then I want you to pick one of those subsections. And a lot of that research I posted is, late 90s, early 2000s. So I want you to find a more current source, hopefully within the last 5 years. And I want you to do a critical analysis of that journal article. So the complete directions are on the homework website, but essentially you'll pick that article, you'll cite that article in MLA or APA in the discussion board. You will write a paper. Now I haven't, because I'm doing it on the discussion board, write it out in Word first. Write out your essay following that criteria of an intro and thesis, a summary of your article, a brief summary of what the article says. Pick out 2 points that connect with the research that you've read in the folder and the information on the PowerPoint. Critically connect those two. So what does that current research say? How does it connect with that older research? Does it confirm? Does it counter? Does it expand it? 2 points like that. So 2 paragraphs in that section. And then a discussion. What does this mean? What does this tell us about language use? What does it tell us about society and language, or cultural and language? And then post that. So write it out in Word, copy and paste it into the discussion board, because the way that it's set up so that you can see other people's posts, it won't let you edit once you post it. So write it out, edit. When you're done with that essay, copy and paste it into the discussion board post. Once you do that, that will allow you to see other people's posts. And then you can read and see what other people, get some ideas from their research, especially as you're thinking about papers. Homework 2. So that first one, due just like normal. You get it Tuesday of week 10. It's due Tuesday of week 11. Not a problem. But homework 2, I posted on there. It's not due actually until week 12, because we're going to cover some more topics. Probably won't even cover all of the topics that could be possible paper topics. But by week 12, I want you to have filled out that form that kind of gets you into the research of what you want to write this paper about, this course paper. So it's got some questions. It's got some direction to do some research and finding some research articles for your potential topic. And then you don't upload that until week 12, Thursday, 2:30, and I'll remind you as we go along. But I want you to start researching and thinking about your course paper for this class. Okay, so this is the only PowerPoint we have for this week, and then I'll let you work on that research, those readings, viewings, and research to post on the discussion board. If you have any questions, I'll have a discussion board for questions for the homework, and then we can set up some Zoom meetings or whatever, Skype or telephone. So, all right, stay safe. I hope everybody's well and being able to navigate this online world of all classes. And let me know if there's something I can do to kind of help ease the burden. So, have a good week. I'll talk to you soon.